Our first question today then is, has the world changed since God made it? Let's get our Bibles and turn to Genesis 3, verses 1 to 13. I want you to pause the video and have a read through the passage yourself or with someone else, and see if you can spot any clues to help us answer this question. So, has the world changed since God made it? So pause and read and see what you can find out. So we see that the world God made has been spoiled by sin. Adam and Eve disobeyed God by eating from the one tree that God had told them not to. He gave them everything that they needed for a good life. He had given them a place to live. He had given them a job to do. And he'd given them the things that they needed to eat and to live. But they didn't fully trust what he had said, did they? They listened to the serpent and they thought, maybe God didn't get it quite right. Maybe that's not what God meant when he said that. And there's some examples in Genesis 3 of what had changed. So we see that they had to leave the garden that God had created for them to live in. They noticed that they were naked and they felt embarrassed about it. And instead of walking happily in the garden with God, they felt like they needed to hide from him. Now, all of these things were different from when God made the world. Think back to what we read in Genesis 1 with Sam last week. It was no longer perfect because it had been spoilt by sin. And we could look around our world now, and we can also see ways that the world has been spoiled by sin. Just like last week, we could look around and see some of the beautiful things that God had created. And that leads us on to think about our second question today. Our second question is, what is sin? Now, sometimes the word sin can seem quite big. And it can seem like an idea that's hard for us to understand. What exactly does it mean? Well, sin is thinking, wanting, or doing what displeases God. And sometimes I find it helpful to think of it using this little saying with the letters S-I-N. So we can say, shove off, God. I'm in charge. No to your ways. So shove off, God. I'm in charge. No to your ways. God had made a perfect world. He'd given Adam and Eve everything that they needed to have a good life. But when the serpent came along and asked Eve if God really said what he did, she chose to trust the words of the serpent more than the words of God. She said, okay, God, I think this way is more important than your way in my life. She said, I'm going to choose to go this way rather than go the way that you have told me to go. And we can often do the same in our lives. When we stop trusting God and we stop loving God, and when we stop loving God, we stop obeying him and doing the things that he asks us to do in his word. We no longer love the things that he loves, but we want to please ourselves. Now, that might mean lots of different things for each of us. It might mean deciding not to pray or read our Bibles because we're tired and we can't be bothered. That might mean saying something nasty to a sibling or someone in our class rather than being kind to them. It might mean lying to a parent or a teacher when we just don't want to admit that we've maybe done something wrong. There are so many different ways that sin can affect our lives and that we can choose to go our way rather than God's way. So we can see from this that sin is a big deal. We can't pretend that it doesn't matter. And sin is a problem for us all. We will all choose to do, think, want, or say things which displease God. We will all have times when we say to God, my ways are better than your ways. Now, you might remember last year we looked at some memory verses in Romans, and one of them is very helpful for us in this question. Do you remember what it said in Romans 3, verse 23? Now, we used the tune of head, shoulders, knees and toes to learn this one, if that helps you to remember what it was. Well, it said, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." When we sin, we're choosing to do things that displease God, and we are all going to do it at some points, and often a lot of times. Now, that might seem a little bit sad and a little bit of a downer compared to last week when we were thinking about all the amazing things of creation. So does that mean that the world will always be this way and that there's no hope? Well, absolutely not. We're going to think a little bit more about sin and also about the hope that there is for us all for sin in Jesus over the next few weeks. So make sure to keep watching to see and to remind ourselves of the solution. Now, there's a couple of songs below to have a sing along to, and then there's another video which looks at the memory verse and activity for this week.